The first contrast strikes long before the border signs fade into the rearview mirror. Life in Canada unfolds with a softness that feels almost engineered to unsettle Americans who arrive expecting a colder replica of home. The streets look familiar, the skyline carries echoes of U.S. cities, yet the atmosphere moves differently, quieter, steadier, as if the country breathes at a slower frequency. What surprises many Americans is not the snow or the bilingual signs, but the gentleness woven into ordinary moments. Motorists easing to a stop long before pedestrians step off the curb. Strangers offering unhurried smiles, and entire crowds moving with a collective calm that seems to mute the usual chaos of city life. That contrast becomes the hook, the first signal that the rhythms north of the border follow rules built on an entirely different emotional foundation. The earliest impressions most Americans describe involve atmosphere rather than architecture. Public spaces feel unusually serene. Transit stations carry chatter but not commotion. Sidewalks remain lively without the frantic push that defines movement in many U.S. cities. Even in dense urban centers, the noise seems to soften at the edges, as if the environment itself has agreed not to overwhelm you. The emotional climate shifts too. Interactions with clerks, drivers, and commuters are marked by a light courtesy that feels instinctive rather than performative. Sorry floats through the air not as guilt but as social cushioning, reducing friction before it forms. For Americans accustomed to directness and rapid pace, this restraint can feel both refreshing and disorienting. A cultural quietness that doesn't match the familiar cadence of home. Beneath these first impressions lies a deeper set of differences rooted in values. While the United States often rewards assertiveness, speed, and individual momentum, Canada leans into patience, cooperation, and shared responsibility. The slower and rushed rhythm of daily life reflects a collective mindset shaped by long winters, diverse communities, and an emphasis on social harmony. Public arguments rarely escalate. Line cutting is nearly unthinkable, and courtesy acts like an invisible infrastructure supporting everyday life. Even the way people use space signals a different worldview, less territorial, more trusting, more willing to assume good intentions from strangers. To many Americans, this emotional gentleness feels foreign because it challenges the assumption that efficiency always matters more than empathy. These contrasts reveal themselves through small, symbolic encounters. A crowded bus where riders quietly thank the driver one by one. A grocery store where conversations linger lightly instead of rushing toward the exit. Snowstorms where neighbors appear unprompted with shovels, treating cooperation as routine rather than remarkable. None of these moments are dramatic, yet each illustrates a cultural pattern built on consensus rather than competition. Even financial habits reflect this difference. Modest displays of wealth, relaxed tipping expectations, and a general preference for practicality over status. For many Americans, the cumulative effect of these interactions creates a sense of being gently guided into an unfamiliar social script, one where assertiveness yields to consideration and where personal space exists without constant vigilance. Over time, these traits begin to shape the emotional environment around newcomers. Many Americans find that the slower communications, the softened tone of daily interactions, and the high trust placed in systems and strangers gradually shift their own behavior. They stop speaking as quickly. They wait longer before entering conversations. They begin to mirror the reflexive politeness surrounding them, even when it once felt excessive. But in these early weeks, the adjustment can be overwhelming. The calm that Canadians carry as second nature often confronts Americans with the realization that their own cultural pace has been louder and more urgent than they ever understood. The longer Americans spend in Canada, the more the country's deeper cultural layers reveal themselves. What first felt like simple politeness begins to look more like a national philosophy, a shared belief that life functions best when people account for one another's comfort. Conversations unfold at a measured pace, without the sharp edges or competitive undertones that often shape social exchanges in the United States. Even disagreements take on a gentler structure, held within boundaries that avoid escalation. Public life seems intentionally designed to reduce friction. Foot traffic flows smoothly. Buses wait an extra moment for someone running to catch them, and doors are held open with a patience that feels almost ceremonial. These habits exist not as exceptional kindness, but as normalized behavior, shaped by generations raised to consider the group before the individual. The emotional climate that emerges from this philosophy feels uniquely Canadian: calm, respectful, and quietly resilient. Daily interactions make this difference unmistakable. Americans often mention how startling it feels to witness conflict dissolve before it even forms. A near collision on the sidewalk ends in mutual apologies rather than irritation. Lines move with subtle cooperation, people stepping aside, giving space, acknowledging others. Even late-night urban scenes lack the tension Americans instinctively prepare for. Canada's sense of safety, described in countless accounts, becomes one of the most powerful shocks. Streets at dusk feel open rather than threatening. Teenagers gather in parks without anxious parental oversight. Strangers leave bags unattended for a moment and expect them to remain untouched. The emotional weight this removes is profound. Many Americans only realize in hindsight how much vigilance defined their lives back home. The absence of that constant mental scanning reveals how heavy it truly was. These impressions are reinforced by a cultural trust that quietly structures Canadian life. Public systems, transit, healthcare, emergency services carry an expectation of reliability, and people respond to them with cooperation rather than suspicion. This trust spills into everyday routines: bicycles left unlocked outside coffee shops, lost items returned without fuss, communities activating organically during snowstorms or local crises. Americans observing these patterns often describe a sense of emotional disorientation. The instinct to guard, to question, to expect the worst feels increasingly out of place in an environment built on mutual confidence. The contrast reveals itself most sharply in public safety, where the absence of widespread fear around guns reshapes the entire emotional geography of a city. Crowds feel less volatile. Disagreements remain conversations rather than potential flashpoints. And the social energy on sidewalks, buses, and campuses carries a softness not often found in American public space. These cultural characteristics ripple into symbolic moments that stay with newcomers. A driver waves another through instead of accelerating. A neighbor appears during a snowstorm with an extra shovel. Friends gather for modest, egalitarian social events where everyone contributes rather than relying on a single host. Even when a force that might intimidate outsiders becomes a communal anchor. People share tips, help push stuck cars, and laugh through the cold with a resilience that feels distinctly collective rather than individualistic. Workplaces reflect the same cooperative spirit. The pace is steady rather than urgent. Breaks are respected. Even ambition is expressed through collaboration rather than personal elevation. For many Americans, this creates a surprising emotional shift. Status signals feel muted. Conversations prioritize balance over achievement. Success appears grounded rather than displayed. As these experiences accumulate, Americans find themselves confronted with subtle internal changes. Their manner of speaking softens. Their instincts to compete quiet. The ever-present feeling of rushing begins to unwind. Yet for many, this transition feels strangely difficult at first. The stillness that Canadians view as normal can feel unsettling to someone raised in a culture that rewards motion, expression, and acceleration. Adapting requires releasing habits that once felt like survival. Canada's emotional environment does not demand surrender. It simply offers an alternative, one built on trust, calmness, and quiet respect. That exposure alone is enough to shift a worldview, even before the transformation fully takes root. Over time, the slow cultural reshaping becomes impossible for many Americans to ignore. What felt foreign in the beginning begins to work its way into their rhythm. The instinct to apologize becomes reflexive. Conversations settle into a gentler cadence. The expectation of conflict fades as strangers repeatedly confirm that tension rarely escalates here. The emotional guard many Americans carry throughout daily life begins to lower. Even something as simple as walking through a quiet neighborhood at night feels different, lighter, less charged, free of the defensive posture that once felt automatic. This internal shift mirrors the cultural landscape around them, a landscape built on cooperation rather than assertion, on gentleness rather than urgency. It's here that many Americans realize Canada hasn't simply introduced them to new habits. It has quietly reframed what normal life can feel like. The transformation deepens as the collective mindset of the country becomes more visible. Modesty replaces competition as a social default. People discuss community issues with a tone that prioritizes fairness over dominance. Public behavior reflects an awareness that personal choices affect the group, whether in line etiquette, environmental habits, or neighborly responsibilities. Americans observing these patterns often experience a kind of cultural recalibration. The pressure to perform, impress, or outpace others fades in an environment where social respect is not earned through achievement but assumed through decency. This shift strengthens when winter demands teamwork. The season that many outsiders fear becomes a unifying ritual. People help strangers dig out cars, clear sidewalks, and navigate icy streets without hesitating. In these moments, resilience appears less as heroic endurance and more as communal routine, a reminder that shared challenges create shared bonds. As these habits become familiar, many Americans notice a growing sense of emotional clarity. The ever-present comparison culture of the United States feels distant. The competitive social cues disappear. Instead of chasing speed, they begin to appreciate calm. Instead of scanning for danger, they begin to trust their surroundings. The trust Canadians place in institutions, which once felt foreign, gradually feels reassuring. Systems that function predictably create space for people to focus on living rather than protecting themselves. This emotional unburdening often becomes the most profound cultural shift of all. People walk with unhurried steps, enjoy quiet moments, and carry less internal tension. The realization emerges that safety is not just a civic feature but an emotional experience, one that fundamentally changes how people move through the world. Eventually, the story of why some Americans struggle with life in Canada becomes clearer. The struggle rarely comes from weather, cost, or logistics. It comes from the adjustment to stillness, cooperation, and trust, traits that challenge deeply ingrained habits shaped by a faster, louder, more individualistic society. For some, the calm feels too quiet, the politeness too constant, the emotional openness too gentle. But for many others, the shift becomes transformative. They begin to recognize how cultural priorities shape daily life, how small gestures accumulate into a national atmosphere, and how a society built on subtle cooperation can influence the inner tempo of anyone who stays long enough to absorb it. Canada does not demand change, yet it quietly inspires it. It teaches that resilience can be soft, that strength can be communal, and that kindness can function as a form of social architecture rather than ornamentation. For Americans who embrace this shift, life in Canada becomes less about adapting to a new country and more about rediscovering a different way to exist in the world. And the reflection that follows often carries a gentle universality. Cultures do not shape people through grand gestures but through everyday habits that reveal what a society values, what it protects, and what it believes life should feel like.